What is clean core? What is technical debt? Well, they're buzzwords that don't mean a lot. That's what I want to talk about today. My name is Marcus Harris. I'm a software and technology attorney. For the past 20 years, I've drafted and negotiated a variety of software-related contracts and litigated failed software projects in courts across the country. Software vendors push clean core. They push issues like technical debt, best practices. All of these are buzzwords that really don't mean a lot in the bigger context. But what they mean for vendors like SAP in particular really is a way to mitigate the perceived risk associated with transitioning to SAP S/4HANA, transitioning to a new system, transitioning to the cloud, whatever it is. They say, look, we've got rise, we've got grow. These mitigate the likelihood of a failure. You want to adopt the clean core. This is what the new way to do things are. And this is really kind of, everything's old, everything new is really old, and there's nothing magical about these terms. What is clean core? Well, clean core essentially is relying on standard SAP functionality. It's extending the software through platforms like SAP, BTP, preserving compatibility across all future SAP releases, and then it's governing customized development to maintain transparency with the system. And it's allowing key user extensibility without altering the core logic of the system. And so the concept, I think, sounds good on paper. And really what you're doing is you're trying to implement the software product out of the box, with the goal being that you're going to have a flexible system that's going to be easy to upgrade and update as future releases and modifications and patches come out. And I think, look, there's certainly value to that, right? But if you're going to be transitioning from a legacy ECC system, a legacy software system to this new system, the concept of clean core may not really make a lot of sense. And the challenge that you're going to have is that you've got this ABAP code, the SAP ABAP code in the case of SAP, that really relies on many layers of customizations. That's what SAP, that's how they would characterize it, and they would call that technical debt. But if you look at it objectively, there's a reason why that those modifications and customizations were made to that software system. That software system, in many cases, works fine today, and it addresses key functionality gaps in the software. And it's streamlined to work with your business in a way that makes you more efficient, that makes you different than your competitors, and provides a competitive advantage in the marketplace for you. You've adopted that software with these modifications so that it preserves your secret sauce. So then the question is, if I'm going to move over to a new software system, why am I going to get rid of my technical debt for the advantages of the clean core or a clean core? And and I think again, you've got to look at the motivation behind this. I mean, if SAP can get you to adopt this clean core initiative, this clean core strategy, who's really benefiting from that? Is it you or is it SAP? And the answer to the question really is it's going to be SAP. And the reason for that is they're going to be able to push updates, upgrades to you much more easily. They're going to get rid of all of the customized ABAP code that is standing in the way and making it more difficult for you to adopt new innovations and new products. Whether it's the latest and greatest artificial intelligence functionality or some other functionality that SAP is incorporating into the software, it's all going to work. And so, I think, who does this benefit more? Well, I think certainly, if you've got a highly customized system that works for you, it's not really to your benefit to do this. It's to SAP's benefit. Now, you can look at this too, and you can say, okay, well, look, let's get rid of a lot of these customizations. The new system addresses those. Well, the question is really, does it? You're going to abandon the highly customized system that works for you to more of a vanilla kind of out-of-the-box system that maybe doesn't work as well for you. But what it does for SAP is it makes it easier for them to sell you updates, upgrades, modifications, configurations, and customizations to that software, because it's all going to work, right? They don't have to go in and tinker with the customizations and the like. So, I think a lot of this is really for the benefit of SAP. SAP is not going to tell it to you that way. I mean, what they're going to say, look, you want to get rid of the layers of customizations to the code, that were built to address your one-off requirements. The result that you've got from that, this is what SAP would tell you, is that you've got a cluttered landscape of custom code that presents a variety of risks to your business. First of all, it's going to delay upgrades, so each new release is going to require retesting and rework. There's going to be a higher total cost of ownership. Maintenance grows harder as custom logic ages, and I think that's certainly true. There's going to be a reduction in adaptability. Connecting new technologies, like I said, AI or analytics, becomes more complicated with a highly customized system. And then there's going to be security exposure. So SAP will tell you, non-standard modifications have the ability at least to introduce potential vulnerabilities into the system. And I think there's a lot there. And many of these things are risks, but I think they can be mitigated and they can be worked around. And to really have kind of a black and white statement that clean core is the way to go and it's good and technical debt is just bad is just not a realistic way to look at the problem. I think it's much more nuanced than that. SAP is going to look at the clean core and the way that clean core, then the way that they're going to sell it to you is they're going to say, look, it's going to streamline your integrations through standardized APIs and connectors. It's going to have a faster response to business or process changes. There's going to be less testing for each upgrade. There's going to be centralized visibility, stronger governance associated with it. There's going to be consistent behavior across multiple cloud landscapes, and certainly there's truth to this, but I think there is a real legitimacy to saying that this is a terrible idea with huge risks, and getting rid of your legacy system and its customizations that really address gaps in functionality. How does that possibly make sense for anybody? And again, the practical advantages to implementing clean core, I think it really benefits the vendor more than it does the customer. The reality is that no ERP system is going to fit your business 100%, and you're going to need to change something. And does customization break the code? Well, sure, but if it's done carefully, there shouldn't. I think there's a way to mitigate a lot of the risks that SAP is highlighting. There's always, like I said, there's always going to be functionality gaps, and they've always been dealt with in a variety of ways. And maybe there's a way here to not customize the core software itself. And if you're going to customize, you can do it with extensions or other apps that integrate with the clean core, so they don't corrupt the code. Certainly, that's an option. But again, if you've got something that works, why are you going to go down this path? I think any vendor that tells you that it's not reasonable to make any customizations is really not being truthful to you. Vendors are going to say this to you all the time, but if you adopt a clean core, how are you differentiating yourself from your competitors? Everybody is going to be the same, and so the great irony associated with this is that all the technological efficiencies and advantages you want to take advantage of associated with this technology, you're really just becoming like everybody else, and it's in some ways it's kind of a race to the bottom. I think this concept of clean core really does challenge businesses to change at a greater magnitude then, because the tech chasm is going to be bigger today. Without making any changes to the software, it makes it even harder to do that. And I think the concept of clean core really shifts the balance of power from your organization to the vendor. What happens when S/4HANA, for example, is obsolete? What do? You have no options. You don't have this customized system that really addresses your needs. You're looking to SAP to make the modifications, the changes. And SAP's track record in this area has not been good. I mean, there's arbitrary deadlines for moving to the cloud. There's explicit threats of not supporting legacy systems with R&D anymore. Really pumping the value of the technology that they want to promote via not customizations, but the integration of these shiny objects like artificial intelligence. And so what are you really left with? You're really at the whim of the software vendor, and I don't think that is a scenario that anybody really wants to be in. So what are your alternatives? Well, I think you can go best of breed. It's now easier to integrate different functionality with software. Many clients are not going all in on cloud. They're doing a hybrid approach, or they're doing private cloud, which I think is a good option. SAP is really known for trying to make it difficult to use third parties, which I think is a problem for many customers, but there are ways certainly to do that, and I think there's certainly investigations into SAP's business practices in the EU going on right now that are going to make that easier on a going forward basis. If you have any questions about anything I've talked about in this video, please feel free to reach out to me. Happy to talk to you and get you pointed in the right direction. Thank you.